Next up, we have Sean Malseed from Greenlane. And he's gonna give it to you in regards to APIs. Sean?
Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Awesome. My name's Sean. I'm from Greenlane Search Marketing in Philadelphia, and I hate to disappoint you, but I'm also an Eagles fan. Yeah! We're everywhere today. Awesome. Today I'm going to be talking about APIs and actually how digging around in Google's guts and finding an undocumented API helped us solve a pretty big problem for a client. And also, we were able to package that up into an SEO tool that we gave away for free, and actually it became very popular. And actually now is one of the top ways that people come across Greenlane for technical SEO. So, a little about me. I'm the technical director at Greenlane. I've been there for about 4 years. Before that, I had my own small business, and I did some consulting. I also worked at SEMrush for a number of years. I was actually in charge of API integrations with clients there. I'm not a professional developer by any stretch, but I like to think of myself as an extreme amateur developer, or maybe better phrased as knows enough to be dangerous professionally. And what I think that means is I'm never going to be like a great developer, but probably my main goal would be to be able to work alongside a great developer as they implement stuff, and also to bridge the gap between the people who decide what needs to be implemented and the people actually doing that implementation, which I think is an important role for technical SEOs. I'd also like to mention that there will be free spaghetti during this presentation. And by spaghetti, I mean some code that I wrote. It's not very attractive code. It's not very well organized, hence the term spaghetti. But it does work, and it's stuff that we use all the time. And I hope you'll find it as useful as we do. This spaghetti can be deployed to the cloud in an interesting way. And also, this might be the best stock photo on the internet. And we paid for this, and I have no regrets. And then I just tried to take it. That's too far, I'm sorry. APIs. So if you're not too familiar with APIs, or you've heard the term thrown around but you've never seen it in action, what an API is, well, it stands for Application Programming Interface. Basically, it's a way for two computers to talk to one another over a network like the internet, quickly, efficiently, reliably. So a good example could be if you have a stock app and you type in like the stock, and then it sends it off to the server somewhere in stock land in New York, and the stock server says, okay, this is the ticker, here's the company name, here's the price, here's other stock things. And then the developers program the app so that it formats all that data into the interface, into the user. It's just a seamless experience, even though it's pulling data from maybe all sorts of disparate sources on the internet. So with that in mind, APIs are really intended for developers who are trying to build robust dynamic applications. But the secondary kind of person who might be interested in an API is one of the kind of people that are probably here today. And two kind of primary ways of finding APIs. There's published APIs. A great example is Google's extremely comprehensive list in their API Explorer. They have crazy stuff in there, even like natural language processing APIs that they just make available to anybody. But what we're going to talk about today are unpublished APIs, which are a lot more fun to find, and sometimes you can do some interesting things just from poking around on a site and trying to see how it works. So there's a story with our client. Client had a problem, and the story begins like most other stories do. We had to overcome the problem. And you might be familiar with this problem, and that's we submitted some URLs to Google in a sitemap, and Google indexed some of them. So of course, we want to see however many URLs we submitted, that's how many is indexed. But more often than not, we see we submitted a ton of URLs, and they're not all indexed. The way to diagnose that historically is in Google, info search operator, and see if it comes back. If it does, indexed. If not, not indexed. But the problem is that doesn't really scale. So our client in particular had literally a bajillion pages. They were basically a platform for people to find really hyper-local service providers. So people would generally find the site by searching for service in town or service in city. So this client, since the beginning of time, set up their site with a local landing page for literally every town and city in America. Yeah, it's a little crazy, but that's how they set it up, and it worked. And since the beginning of their company, some of those pages, like the Philly page, tons of traffic, tons of revenue and everything, but then other pages got zero traffic. And the question, of course, is, are they getting no traffic because it's not indexed, or is it because people aren't actually searching in that town, or what? And we can't go into the client, of course, and say, hey, this is crazy. We want to just erase all of this and do something different, because they'll tell you you're crazy, why, and probably fire you. Fortunately, we're not the only one with this problem. And actually, if you type "are my pages" into a Google search, the first suggestion is, are my pages indexed in Google? And the second suggestion is, why are my pages not indexed in Google? Which is pretty fitting. And you can find a lot of solutions. Most of them are something like this. A bunch of proxies plugged into some kind of web scraper and do that info search, dump it all into Excel. But there's a lot of pitfalls with that. Like I forgot to put the proxies on. And then there's some problems, and people in the office start looking at you, and they say, why do I have to, what are these puzzles that keep coming up? I say, I don't know what they are. It's not me. And really, it's just because Google can't be cool about it. I mean, they kind of taunt you with exactly how many URLs they've indexed and exactly how many URLs you sent them. But if you say which ones are indexed, figure it out yourself. So that's really frustrating. And when things are frustrating and kind of tedious, my initial response is to just ignore it and procrastinate. So I think maybe the best suggestion I'm going to give today is my top tip for procrastination, which I found to be really successful. And that's, if you're just going to click around randomly on the internet, do it with Chrome Developer Tools open, and especially with the XHR tab under Network Requests, because that looks like you're doing something. If somebody walks by your desk and they see all this stuff on the side flying around, they're going to say, this guy's doing something, I'm not going to interrupt them. And you can get away with the whole day like this. It's really awesome. But you can also get a little bit of production out of doing this. So in this case here, I'm procrastinating and I'm playing with Google search. I'm searching for skateboards to buy, whatever. I'm old. But if we look in network requests under XHR, we see that actually every time you type a letter into the search box, it's making an API call to somewhere in the Google mothership, and it's coming back with the suggestions. Which is actually crazy if you think about it, because everybody talks about how many searches does Google handle worldwide every second, but it's actually how many times does somebody push a key in the search box every second worldwide. And for every time somebody pushes one letter, it sends something up to the mothership that does some complicated logic to figure out what they think you might be searching for. And that's kind of an intense amount of computer power. But we don't really care about that. What's more interesting is looking inside the API, and we can see it's actually just a very simple list of the suggest keywords for whatever you're trying to search. So that can be kind of helpful. This trick works on lots of websites. Another place you might like to procrastinate is Wikipedia. There's kind of a new feature on Wikipedia. When you hover over a link to another article, it pops up a nice little box with an excerpt and a nice picture. But if you look in network requests when you're doing that, you can see it's actually making an API call every time you hover over one of the links. And if you look inside the API call, there's some interesting information in the response, such as the kind of categories that it's in, links to other APIs that have things like the full text of the article in plain text and the full HTML source. And that's pretty neat stuff. And then if you go to the API URL directly, we can see we can actually access that information directly in a browser. So when you can access information directly, you can basically do anything with it. In this sheet that I've linked here, all I'm doing is using that Google Suggest API and pulling in, just in a formula, suggest keywords for a given keyword. Now, you can take this a lot further. You could, for instance, do a suggest search for each of the suggest keywords automatically and build out like a gigantic list of related keywords straight from the keyword source itself, Google. Or you could take it further. You could use that Wikipedia API and run that on all the suggest keywords and, for instance, see what kind of topics are kind of related to whatever term that you're entering, which ones have an article for them. So I kind of like to think if you're on a reasonably modern website and something pops up or slides across or whatever, probably there's an API under the surface that powers it. And if so, there's a good chance you can kind of take that API and then do something interesting with it. So that's enough procrastination. Time to be productive. That's actually a really obscure operating system reference, and if you can see what that reference is in this picture, we should be friends. So poking around on Google, trying to see if there's something like the suggest keyword API that can help us with this indexation problem. So going back to just opening network requests and clicking around and visiting those URLs, and all of a sudden, f.txt downloads. I didn't ask it to download. It just kind of force downloaded itself. So that's weird. So what is that? Well, turns out that's an API of the entire SERP. So that could be pretty useful in our situation. And in fact, it was. And that's how we solved the indexation problem. And that also brings us to the first course of Spaghetti, which is that solution. So what we did is we took that f.txt URL, that API URL, and we popped in some spaghetti into the Google indexation, the Google Apps script to make an indexation tester, build a function that we could just pop into a spreadsheet, and it runs in the background. We put it on like a timer, and then it'll just blow through an entire list of URLs, searching those URLs as if they were a keyword, then looping through the results. If it's in there, it's indexed. If it's not or it's empty, then it's not indexed. Now, if you're familiar with Google Apps Script, you might think, well, it times out after 5 minutes, and that's not enough time to run 1 bajillion URLs. But there is something called triggers in Google Apps Script, which is basically makes it like a cron job or like AWS Lambda function or something, and it'll just run forever in Google's cloud or until you delete that trigger. Another question you might have is, well, if I'm just running all these URLs in the background automatically, am I going to just blow up my IP address? Well, the other interesting thing about doing this stuff from inside Google Apps Script or Docs is that the request doesn't come from your IP address. The request actually comes from inside Google's cloud. So when you're hitting Google from inside an app script, you're hitting Google from Google, which means that Google's not going to give itself a CAPTCHA, and in fact, it doesn't. So this works great. And we're giving this out. So we packaged it into an SEO tool, gave it out, became pretty popular. A lot of people have seen it. The version that we released is kind of watered down. The reason being is that our internal version does batches of URLs because it's a lot faster, but it doesn't provide obvious immediate feedback. So you click the button and it runs for a while and people say, oh, this isn't working, and they leave. So we made a version that does each URL one at a time so people can see that feedback. It's a lot more user-friendly, but it's also a lot slower. So for us today, this is our internal version. This runs in the background, and actually it has a start button. You click it, it automatically generates that trigger, and it'll just run in the background until it's finished your list of URLs and then delete the trigger. You don't even have to keep the tab open. You can close it, log out of Google, throw your computer away, whatever, and this will just run forever until it's finished. So this is something we use all the time at Greenlane, and I hope that you guys will find it useful as well. So we have this interesting API. So what else can we do with it? So one thing that we thought is, what if we play with the parameters in the API URL a little bit? So after some messing around, we found that we could get it to return the top 100 search results. And then we took that and we made a SERP tracker. So this is something we use all the time. All it does is every day it makes a new column in the sheet, top 100 search results for a keyword, and it will just go forever, every day until the end of time, or it runs out of how many cells are allowed in a Google sheet. I don't know what that number is. But this is really helpful, of course, if you want to track minor SERP fluctuations, or you want to see somebody publishes articles frequently, how quickly are they indexed, how quickly do they kind of age out of the index, and kind of watch that daily SERP fluctuation. So that one's not as user-friendly as the indexation tool. The only thing you have to do is set up the trigger manually. It's pretty easy to do. I have some instructions there. In the slide, you just set it to run daily, and it's a set and forget and just check when you're curious kind of thing. And now the third and final course of spaghetti. So we have this interesting API, but it has kind of a pretty big caveat in that we can only create a tool within Google Docs if we want to have that benefit of hitting Google from within Google. So what can we do if we want to use that tool like in a, if we want to write something that runs just in the browser and it's more complicated, how do we do that but we still have that benefit of hitting Google from Google? Well, what if we take that API and wrap it in our own API, like an API-ception? And so that's exactly what we did. So one of the other really interesting things about Google Apps Script is that it doesn't have to be attached to a document. It can run just on its own in the cloud, just like an Amazon function or something. It's actually pretty incredible that you can just do this for free. And if you publish it as a web app, then it gives you a URL that you can hit, and then it'll run your function and give you whatever result. And that works exactly like an API that you just literally built in Google Apps Script. Now, one problem with that is something called cross-origin request sharing. If you've never heard of that, that is kind of a security feature. So if you build something that runs in a browser, and you try to hit this URL on Google, Chrome is going to yell at you and say, no, that's a CORS violation. So one way to get around that is to not use CORS and instead use JSON-P. So inside that API script, there's a little function called JSON-P-ify that takes all the results, pops it into just a JSON-P format, takes the callback that you give it in the URL, and it works with jQuery's JSON-P functionality, returns the callback just as expected, and then you can basically use this anywhere. Any of your tools, you can build your own stuff. And so we're releasing that today to all of you. We've never released this before or even really talked about it, but it's something that we do use all the time. So this version of it is a rank tracking tool, which is awesome because it takes that script that does the top 100 search results and you give it a domain and a keyword or a URL and a keyword, and it gives you back the rank, and it works extremely quickly because it's getting that from Google to Google and then just pulling that result down through this kind of wrapper code. And then you can use it to do basically anything. Like you could build like a whole back end out of it, basically. And as a proof of concept, we did that. So I put up this site just built in Ember.js. It's pretty simple, but it hits that Google Apps Script API, and it has some additional error handling, and then a nice export function. And we've been able to run thousands of keywords through it at a time, and it comes back extremely quickly. So it seems to work fine, and it's pretty fun. So that's everything I have. So in case you see this later, here's all the links that we used. Thank you very much.
Thank you.